Picture this. November 11th, 1918. Church bells ring across Britain. In every city and village, people pour into the streets, weeping with joy. The nightmare is over. 4 years of slaughter have finally ended. The British Empire stands victorious, its flag planted across continents, ruling over 400 million souls. London looks unstoppable. To anyone watching the victory parades, Britain appears to be at the absolute peak of its power. But walk into the quiet offices of His Majesty's Treasury, and you'll find a very different scene. No champagne, no celebration. Just men in suits staring at numbers that tell a horrifying truth. Britain had just won the war that would destroy it. The cost of defeating Germany had been catastrophic. Britain had liquidated a century of accumulated wealth in just 4 years. They sold off their prized overseas investments, Argentine railways, South African diamond mines, Australian sheep stations, all of it auctioned off to pay for bullets and bread. When that money ran dry, they borrowed, and borrowed, and borrowed some more. The numbers were staggering. Britain's national debt had exploded from $600 million in 1914 to over $7 billion by 1918. But here's the killer. Much of that debt was owed to America, and it had to be repaid in dollars, not pounds. Britain had fundamentally changed overnight. Before 1914, London had been the world's banker, lending money to every nation on earth. Now, Britain was a debtor, cap in hand, owing billions to New York. Even worse, while British factories had been churning out shells and warships, their competitors had quietly stolen their markets. American and Japanese companies had swooped in, selling textiles and machinery to customers who had relied on Britain for generations. The engine of British prosperity, their export industries, was sputtering and dying. But the men who ran Britain refused to see it. The politicians, the bankers, the aristocrats, they all believed the damage was temporary, a brief interruption. Soon, they told themselves, everything would return to normal. Britain would be Britain again, with London at the center of the universe, and normal meant one thing above all else, the gold standard. For nearly a century, the gold standard had been the foundation of British power. It was simple and beautiful. Every pound note was backed by actual gold sitting in the Bank of England's vaults. Walk in with a $5 note, walk out with 5 gold sovereigns. The pound was literally as good as gold. This made sterling the world's reserve currency. From Tokyo to Buenos Aires, international trade happened in pounds. If you wanted to buy oil, sell wheat, or fund a railway, you did it in British currency. This gave Britain extraordinary power, the ability to control global finance from a small island in the North Atlantic. But during the war, Britain had been forced to abandon the gold standard. They needed to print money, massive amounts of it, to pay soldiers and buy weapons. You can't do that when you're chained to a fixed amount of gold. So they cut the link. The result was inevitable: inflation. Prices more than doubled. And the pound, which had been worth $4.86 before the war, plummeted to as low as $3.40 by 1919. To Britain's elite, this wasn't just an economic adjustment. It was a national disgrace. A weak currency meant a weak nation. It signaled to the world that Britain was declining, falling behind America. The devaluation felt like a moral failure, a betrayal of everyone who had trusted in British financial integrity. So a consensus formed among the powerful, politicians, Treasury officials, and especially Montague Norman, the formidable governor of the Bank of England. They all agreed Britain must return to the gold standard immediately. But here's where it gets insane. They didn't just want to go back to gold. They wanted to go back at the exact same rate that existed before the war. They wanted the pound to be worth $4.86 again, pretending that 4 years of economic carnage had never happened. This decision was driven by pride, nostalgia, and a desperate desire to maintain London's prestige against the rising power of New York. They truly believed that if they could just fix the currency, everything else would magically follow. Trade would recover, industry would boom, the empire would be restored. They didn't understand or refuse to accept that the world had permanently changed. America now held most of the world's gold. British industry was no longer efficient enough to support such a strong currency. To force the pound back up to its pre-war value required something brutal, deliberate engineered deflation. They had to make money scarce and expensive. They had to force prices and wages down across the entire economy until the pound was strong enough to equal the dollar again. It was economic strangulation dressed up as financial prudence. The government was about to put the British economy in a straitjacket made of gold, believing it was a suit of armor. The real economy, the factories, the workers, the families, was about to be sacrificed on the altar of financial prestige. To execute this plan, the Bank of England under Montague Norman launched a campaign of deliberate economic pain. The mechanics were brutal. They jacked up interest rates, choking off credit to businesses. The Treasury slashed government spending on housing and social programs. The strategy was simple. Squeeze the economy until prices collapsed. Make life hard enough, they reasoned. and costs would fall, wages would fall, and the pound would naturally rise back to its pre-war glory. It was economic anorexia. Britain was trying to starve itself back into shape. By the early 1920s, the damage was already visible. While the bankers in London's financial district celebrated the strengthening currency, the industrial regions of northern England, Scotland, and Wales were hemorrhaging. Coal mines, shipyards, textile mills, their order books were emptying. The problem was straightforward. As the pound strengthened, British goods became more expensive for foreign buyers. A ton of British steel that cost 100 French francs in 1920 might cost 120 francs in 1922, purely because of the currency shift. British industry, already struggling with outdated equipment and fierce competition, was being priced out of global markets by its own government's policy. Unemployment climbed to 1 million, then 1.5 million. The homes fit for heroes, promised to returning soldiers, became slums of despair and poverty. But the financial elite viewed this suffering with almost religious detachment. Unemployment wasn't a tragedy. It was a necessary adjustment, bitter medicine to cure the patient. Then, in 1924, the stage was set for the final act of this tragedy, through a single political appointment. Winston Churchill became Chancellor of the Exchequer. Yes, that Churchill, the man who would later save civilization in 1940. But in 1924, he was just a politician seeking his place in history, and he knew virtually nothing about economics. He famously confessed that when he looked at Treasury figures, the numbers swam before my eyes. Churchill was a romantic who loved grand historical gestures. The moment he arrived at the Treasury, the high priests of finance surrounded him. Montague Norman and the top civil servants whispered seductively it was his destiny to restore Britain to gold. Only he could restore Britain's honor, banish inflation forever, and make London the center of the world once more. But Churchill had doubts. He'd seen the trenches. He instinctively worried about what this policy would do to ordinary workers, manufacturers, and merchants. In private memos, he questioned his advisors, asking why the interests of finance should override the interests of industry. He wrote, "I would rather see finance less proud and industry more content." To resolve his doubts, Churchill hosted a legendary dinner party. He invited the gold standard's biggest proponents, but also their most vocal critic, the brilliant iconoclastic economist John Maynard Keynes. Keynes was already famous for predicting that the Treaty of Versailles would lead to disaster. Now he turned his analytical scalpel on British Treasury policy. At the dinner, Keynes delivered a devastating argument. The pre-war exchange rate of 486, he told Churchill, was a fantasy. Economic reality had changed. Based on relative production costs in Britain versus America, the pound was actually worth about 10% less, perhaps 440. Keynes warned, if you force the pound back to 486, you'll be artificially overvaluing the currency by 10%. This means every British exporter will effectively face a 10% tax on their goods. Every foreign importer selling into Britain gets a 10% subsidy. To make British goods competitive at that high exchange rate, companies would have to slash their costs by 10%. And since the biggest cost for coal mines and steel mills is labor, that meant wage cuts. Keynes looked Churchill dead in the eye. If you do this, you're declaring war on the working class. You'll force employers to cut wages, which will trigger strikes, social chaos, and destroy British industry. Churchill listened. He was troubled. But the weight of the establishment proved too heavy. The governor of the Bank of England, Treasury officials, city financiers, Conservative Party leaders, they all insisted Keynes was an eccentric radical who didn't understand the moral necessity of sound money. They appealed to Churchill's vanity and patriotism. If Britain didn't return to gold, they warned, America would permanently eclipse the British Empire. Churchill caved. He chose the advice of bankers over the warning of the economist. He chose the past over the future. On April 28, 1925, Winston Churchill rose in the House of Commons to deliver his budget speech. The chamber was packed. With his trademark rhetoric, he announced that Great Britain was returning to the gold standard at the pre-war parity of 486. "Oh, we are often told that the gold standard will shackle us to the United States," Churchill declared. "I will tell you what it will shackle us to. It will shackle us to reality." The House erupted in applause. Members waved their papers. The City of London celebrated. The pound soared. The Times called it a masterpiece of statesmanship. It seemed like the chaos of war had finally ended and order was restored. But outside Westminster, the reality Churchill spoke of hit immediately, and it hit like a hammer. The price of British coal in international markets jumped overnight. Foreign buyers in Italy, South America, and Scandinavia who'd purchased British coal for decades looked at the new prices and simply switched to cheaper German or Polish coal. British coal owners panicked. They were already operating on razor-thin margins. The 10% price increase caused by currency overvaluation wiped out their profits entirely. They were now losing money on every ton of coal hauled from the ground. They had only one option: reduce costs. And they couldn't reduce machinery or transport costs. They had to reduce the cost of men. On June 30th, 1925, just 2 months after Churchill's triumphant speech, the coal owners announced they were terminating the National Wage Agreement. Miners' wages would be cut by 13% to 25%, and their working day would increase from 7 hours to 8. The miners were outraged. They were already among Britain's poorest workers. Their work was dangerous, filthy, and exhausting. Now they were told to work longer for starvation wages, so bankers in London could enjoy a strong currency. The miners' union leader, A.J. Cook, coined a slogan that became the battle cry: "Not a penny off the pay, not a minute on the day." Keynes's prediction had come true faster than even he imagined. The return to gold had transferred the cost of the nation's debt directly onto the backs of its hardest working citizens. The strong pound was essentially a tax on Durham coal miners to subsidize Kensington wine importers. The government, realizing a massive strike was imminent and they weren't prepared, bought time with a temporary subsidy to keep wages up for 9 months. It was a band-aid on a bullet wound. Both sides spent those 9 months preparing for war. The subsidy expired in May 1926. The mine owners refused to back down on wage cuts. The miners refused to accept them. The owners locked them out. On May 3rd, 1926, Union solidarity held. The call went out. Buses stopped. Trains stopped moving. Docks fell silent. Newspaper presses halted. The general strike had begun. Over 1.7 million workers walked off the job, the largest industrial dispute in British history. The country was paralyzed. It felt like revolution. And at the heart of this chaos, invisible but unyielding, was the gold standard, the golden chain strangling the British economy. The government had prepared. They didn't just stockpile coal. They had a secret weapon: the middle class. Thousands of university students, stockbrokers, and retired army officers volunteered to drive buses, unload ships, and operate trains. They saw themselves as defenders of civilization against anarchy. Churchill, the man who'd inadvertently triggered the crisis, now ran the government's propaganda newspaper, the British Gazette. He framed the strike not as a wage dispute, but as an insurrection. He wrote, "This is a conflict which, if fought to its conclusion, can only end in the overthrow of parliamentary government or its decisive victory." The rhetoric worked. The Trade Union Congress leadership, terrified they were drifting into illegal revolutionary territory, capitulated. On May 12th, after just 9 days, they called off the general strike without securing a single guarantee for the miners. It was a betrayal mining communities never forgave. The miners, abandoned and alone, refused to surrender. They stayed out for 6 more grueling months. They watched their children grow thin. They sold furniture for food. They burned their own floorboards for heat. But you cannot strike against arithmetic. By November 1926, starvation forced them back into the pits. They accepted longer hours and lower wages. They had been crushed by the golden straitjacket. The government and the city breathed a sigh of relief. They believed they'd won. Order was restored. The pound was safe at 4.86. They expected the economy would finally boom. But the boom never came. From 1926 to 1929, while the rest of the world enjoyed prosperity, Britain stagnated. In America, the roaring 20s exploded. Cars, radios, skyscrapers built at dizzying speed. Even France and Belgium, who'd sensibly devalued their currencies, saw industries recover and exports grow. Britain remained stuck in the mud. The pound was still overvalued. British goods were still too expensive. Wage cuts weren't enough to compensate for the 10% handicap imposed by the exchange rate. To keep the pound pegged at $4.86, the Bank of England had to maintain high interest rates. If they lowered rates to help businesses borrow and expand, gold would flow out of London to New York, where returns were better. It was a tragedy of economic management. Exactly when British industry needed cheap capital to modernize, the gold standard choked off investment. Old industries, textiles, steel, coal, continued their slow death spiral. Unemployment never dropped below 1 million. In some northern industrial towns, 70% of men were jobless. They stood on street corners, surplus people of an empire that had sacrificed them for a currency symbol. The elite consoled themselves with the notion of sound money. They believed this suffering was buying credibility. They thought they were playing the long game. Then, in 1929, the game board flipped over. In October 1929, Wall Street crashed. The Great Depression began. The shock hit Britain hard. American loans to Europe evaporated. Global trade collapsed. Already fragile British export industries were decimated. Unemployment surged from 1 million to 2.5 million by 1930. But the real crisis, the one that would finally break the gold standard, was a banking crisis. In summer 1931, financial contagion spread across Europe like plague. It started in Austria with the Credit Anstalt Bank collapse, then spread to Germany, causing bank runs there. London banks had lent heavily to Germany. Suddenly, those assets were frozen. The City of London, banker to the world, was caught in a liquidity trap. They owed money to France and America, but couldn't retrieve their money from Germany. Foreign investors, examining the books, realized the Bank of England didn't have enough gold to cover its liabilities. The run moved from Berlin to London. In July 1931, the run on the pound began. Every day, millions of pounds in gold were withdrawn from Bank of England vaults and shipped to Paris and New York. Governor Montague Norman suffered a nervous breakdown and fled to Canada, leaving deputies to fight the fire. The Labour government, led by Ramsay MacDonald, was trapped. To save the pound and stay on gold, orthodox economics demanded they balance the budget and restore confidence. But tax revenue had collapsed. The budget was in deficit. Bankers in New York and Paris sent a clear message. We'll lend you money to defend the pound, but only if you cut government spending. Specifically, unemployment benefits. It was a cruel ultimatum. To save the currency, the government had to cut the lifeline, keeping millions from starvation. The cabinet paralyzed. Half the labor ministers refused. The government collapsed. In August 1931, a national government formed. A coalition with one mandate: save the gold standard. They did exactly what bankers demanded. They passed an emergency budget raising taxes and slashing unemployment benefits by 10%. They cut wages for all public employees, teachers, police, sailors. They inflicted misery on the nation to defend the figure $4.86, believing if the pound fell, civilization itself would collapse. But they'd pushed too far. On September 15, 1931, the Atlantic Fleet was anchored at Invergordon, Scotland. When sailors heard their pay was being cut, pay barely enough to support families, they mutinied. It was a polite British mutiny. No violence. Sailors simply refused to work. They gathered on decks and sang songs. But news that the Royal Navy, ultimate symbol of British power, was mutinying sent shockwaves through global financial markets. If the government couldn't control its own navy, how could it control its currency? The run on the pound became a stampede. In 3 days, the Bank of England lost nearly all remaining gold and foreign currency reserves. They spent millions of borrowed dollars buying pounds to prop up the price, but it was like catching a falling knife. On Saturday, September 19, 1931, Bank of England directors met in emergency session. They looked at empty vaults. They read telegrams from New York refusing further loans. The game was up. They'd starved miners, crushed industry, slashed benefits, provoked a naval mutiny, endured a decade of stagnation, all to defend the gold standard, and they'd failed. On Sunday, September 20th, the government issued a statement. Britain was suspending the gold standard. The pound would no longer be redeemable for gold. It would float, finding its own value in the market. The elite braced for apocalypse. They expected the pound to become worthless, riots, the end of London as a financial center. But on Monday morning, something unexpected happened. The pound fell from $4.86 to about $3.40. Ironically, the exact level it had been in 1919 before this tragic experiment began. But the sky didn't fall. There was no hyperinflation. Milk was still delivered. Buses still ran. In fact, almost immediately, the economy began breathing again. With a cheaper pound, British goods suddenly became competitive. A Rolls-Royce or cotton cloth was now 30% cheaper for Americans or Frenchmen to buy. Exports ticked up. Because the Bank of England no longer had to defend the gold peg, they could slash interest rates. Cheap money flooded the economy, sparking a housing boom in London suburbs. New industries, aviation, automobiles, electronics, began growing, funded by cheap credit. The years following a departure from gold weren't disaster. They were the beginning of recovery. Britain actually recovered from the Depression faster than the United States, largely because they abandoned the golden straitjacket 2 years before Roosevelt did. The British people realized with sickening clarity that the suffering of the last decade had been for nothing. The unemployment, strikes, hunger, all unnecessary. A self-inflicted wound caused by men who cared more about prestige than reality. The golden straitjacket stands as one of history's most painful economic lessons. It proved that currency exists to serve the economy, not the reverse. When a nation sacrifices its people's prosperity to defend a symbol, it destroys the very strength it's trying to project. Britain remained a great power a while longer, but the financial spine of the empire had been broken. The decade of stagnation weakened the industrial base just as a new threat rose in Germany. When Britain faced Hitler in 1939, it did so as a weakened power with a depleted treasury. To fight Nazi Germany, Britain had to borrow from America again. But this time, the Americans drove a hard bargain: cash and carry Lend-Lease. In exchange for destroyers and oil, Britain handed over gold reserves, sold remaining American investments, even leased naval bases to the U.S. Navy. By 1945, the transfer of wealth was complete. The British Empire wasn't just bankrupt, it was financially liquidated. The gold that Montague Norman and Winston Churchill desperately tried to protect in the 1920s was gone, shipped to Fort Knox to pay for guns to liberate Europe. The story of the golden straitjacket is a tragedy of good intentions. The men who made these decisions weren't evil. They were patriots who believed they were doing right and restoring their nation's glory. But they committed economics' cardinal sin. They fell in love with a symbol. They confused the map with the territory. They believed national strength came from the value of coins rather than the productivity of people. They sacrificed the real economy to save the financial economy, and lost both. In the end, the British pound is just a promise. In the 1920s, the British government broke its promise to its own people to keep a promise to a yellow medal. It's a stark reminder to every modern government. An economy exists to serve society, not satisfy a ledger. When that balance is forgotten, empires fall. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, make sure to subscribe, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among those who saw the patterns coming.